I'm going to start by taking us back in time to 8 o'clock in the morning on September 8th, 1975. My little 6-year-old heart was pounding and my hands were shaking and I was holding on really tight to this brand new Holly Hobby lunchbox. I was standing outside this big blue door, afraid to go in. It was my first day of first grade, and all summer long, my 7-year-old brother Michael kept reminding me, "You're not ready for first grade." And in my heart, I knew he was right. So just when I thought, forget first grade, I'm running back to the safety of my old kindergarten classroom, the door opened. And on the other side of this door was the most beautiful young woman. She had long, straight brown hair, and she looked like an angel in this white bell-bottom pantsuit. And she bent down and said, "What's wrong?" And I looked up at her and I said, "Michael said I'm not ready for first grade because I can't read and I practiced all summer, but I still can't do it." And she just smiled. And she said, "You're in luck. Teaching kids to read is my specialty." Her name was Nancy Russell, and her impact on my life is undeniable. And I know you're picturing Nancy Russell in her white bell-bottom pantsuit, and here she is, my beautiful Mrs. Russell, and me sporting that really fashionable 1970s Dorothy Hamill haircut. Anybody else have one? Yes. Okay, young people, we're going to explain Dorothy Hamill to you later after this. So that year, because of Mrs. Russell's patience, persistence, and creativity, this highly anxious, dyslexic kid learned to love reading. And I grew to love everything about first grade. My confidence grew, and the next year I strutted into that second grade classroom with a new attitude and a new lunchbox. Charlie's Angels. You know what I'm talking about. Okay, who had one of these? With a matching thermos? And I would continue to love school, so much that I became a teacher just like Mrs. Russell. And then I became a school principal, and eventually a college professor. And the longer I spent in education, the more I reflected on the impact Miss Russell made on my life. Because everything I achieved was built on the foundation she laid back in first grade. And I thought, had she shown frustration or doubt when I struggled, I would see myself differently as a learner. But she didn't. Every day she came in positive, and she believed in me, so I could believe in myself. And I felt so lucky to have been her student. So I wondered if everyone has a Mrs. Russell. And driven by curiosity, truthfully more like obsession, I started to ask anyone, anywhere, like random strangers on benches and buses, about their favorite teachers. And then I showed up at farmers markets, craft fairs, and public parks with this sign that said, "Let's chat about a teacher you remember." Now, I'm a qualitative researcher, so I'm used to doing interviews, but sitting at the park with a sign was not my usual method of data collection. It was, however, the best crazy idea I've ever had, and I have a lot of crazy ideas. But this one taught me so much about the impact teachers make on students' lives. And now, almost 3 years and 300 stories later, I think I understand a little bit more about Mrs. Russell and teachers like her. So I would end up naming this project Chalk and Chances, because those are the tools teachers like Miss Russell used to change my life. Lots of chalk, lots of chances. I could spend weeks telling you everything I've learned about teacher impact, but our time here is short. So I promise I'll tell you as much as I can in this space of time, but if you want to dive deeper, I'll cover even more ground in the breakout session this afternoon. Fair enough? All right, good. Let's get into the data. When I started to analyze this data, I realized what people remember most about their favorite teachers is the way those teachers made them feel. In the classrooms of teachers we remember, people described over and over again feeling safe, seen, and stretched. And although the stories I collected in this project have different details and context, safe, seen, and stretched are consistent themes, and I have not found an exception yet. So what does that mean for us? It means we can use these teachers as models and figure out ways to make our own students feel more safe, seen, and stretched. It means we can look at the things these teachers said or did that stuck with kids, and we can all make a bigger impact on the people we serve. Let's start with feeling safe. We know learning is a vulnerable act. When our students answer a question, offer an opinion, or share an idea, they risk potential embarrassment, shame, or even rejection. And if our classrooms are not safe spaces, they spend their energy being hypervigilant, protecting themselves from those risks. But if we create classrooms where kids feel safe, then they'll risk making a mistake. They'll accept our feedback. They'll take the chances they need to take as learners. My data is full of stories about teachers who intentionally built a culture of trust and safety in the classroom. And one example is Shelby's story. So Shelby shared with me a story about her 4th grade teacher, Mrs. Burns. Shelby said, "I was a scattered kid. I was constantly misplacing and losing things, and my teachers would get very aggravated with me when things weren't where I needed them. The field trip slip, the library books." She said one day about 2 weeks into 4th grade, Miss Burns called her over because she hadn't been turning in homework. And Shelby said it was ready for the usual lecture. I've heard it so many times that Mrs. Burns did something no one else did. She started asking questions. She said, "Shelby, where do you go after school? What's your routine? What's going on?" And Shelby said, "I explained to my teacher that I live with my mom and she works 3 jobs. So usually one of my aunts picks me up after school, sometimes grandma. I never really know where I'm going to go. And if my mom has to work late, which happens more often lately than not, I spend the night at a relative's house. So my stuff is here, there, and everywhere, but never where I need it." And Shelby said Mrs. Burns listened, and she thought about that, and she said, "Tomorrow when you come to school, don't wait for the bell to ring, run and grab your breakfast and come in here." And when Shelby got in that classroom, there was a little desk set up in the corner, had a can of pencils and a place for her to put her books. And every morning, Shelby would come in and work on her homework at that little desk. She would keep the things she needed there. And she described that as a little oasis in her otherwise chaotic life. And she said to me something that stuck with me as a teacher. She said sometimes that desk in Mrs. Burns' classroom felt more like home than home. So I thought about that, and I thought about my classroom from a student's perspective. And I really had to think about how I could intentionally make my students feel safe. How about you? How do you create a space of trust and safety in your classroom? And once we've done that, there's a reason safe comes first. Once we've made it a place where kids can take risks, where they feel safe enough to be themselves, then they can let themselves be seen. So let's talk about feeling seen. We know that when we make assumptions about our students based on characteristics like their gender, their race, their background, that has an impact on their achievement, on their identity, even their sense of belonging. But instead, if we look at our students with curiosity and an open mind, they will reveal things that helps us teach them. If we look at them and really wonder about their struggles, their needs, their hopes, and their dreams, we can find the information we need to make a bigger impact on their lives. My data is also full of stories about teachers who did that. And Jacob's story is an example. Jacob said he grew up in a small rural area of West Virginia, in a town where everybody looks much like him. But he felt very different, like he didn't belong. Both of his parents were deaf, and they often depended on Jacob to interpret things for them in sign language. So he remembers going into history class the first day in 7th grade and meeting Miss Wick. And he said Miss Wick stood out for a lot of reasons. She had a lot of energy. She seemed bigger than her tiny frame. And he said, she was the first black teacher I ever had in that little town. And she really stood out in that school. And I realized we both felt a little different, and I felt so connected to her. And that first day in history class, she posed a question. What is history? And Jacob said, I really thought about how I might interpret that word in sign language. So it occurred to me, his story. And I raised my hand and I said, his story. It must be someone's story. And the other kids laughed. They thought that was a crazy answer. But Miss Wick just smiled at him and said, that is very astute. And then she went on to explain the origin of the word. And he said, from that moment on in history class, I was hooked. I loved learning about history. Miss Wick loved teaching about history, and I came to love her. And he said, the thing I loved most about her was she didn't just tolerate differences. She celebrated differences. And Jacob said, I carried those lessons from Miss Wick's history class through 4 tours in the Middle East. And then I retired from the Army, and I decided I'm going to do something even more challenging. So I became a middle school teacher, like Miss Wick. So when we made the classroom a safe place, and when we let kids show up and be themselves and be seen, then we can stretch them. Because we have to grow, we have to know them before we can grow them. We have to understand them so we can give them the things they need to learn and grow, and we can push them to reach their potential. And stretching kids happens in the context of a personal relationship. Stretching kids happens when we love and accept them just the way they are, but also see their potential. And Beth is one of my graduate students, and one of the things that's really surprised me about the program is about this project is how I've had conversations with my own students and the things that their stories about their favorite teachers revealed about them. And I realized I really didn't know the stories of the people sitting right in front of me in my graduate classes every evening. So Beth shared this story. She said, I was in 1st grade when my older brother was suddenly killed in an accident. And she said, I remember feeling so unhappy and thinking I would never feel joy again. And I was out of school for a week when my 1st grade teacher, Miss Rivers, knocked on our door. She came into the living room, and Miss Rivers sat down next to me, and she put this plastic jug on the table. And Beth said, I looked in the jug, and coming out of the top was a stick with a leaf and a chrysalis hanging from it. And she said, I remember Miss Rivers leaning in really closely and saying, Beth, this caterpillar or this butterfly is not in a good place right now. It's going to struggle for a while, but in the end, it's going to come out stronger and more beautiful, and so will you. And she said it made such an impact on me as a little girl, and I remember carrying that jug with me for about a week, and then seeing the chrysalis start to shake, and eventually a butterfly did emerge, flap its wet wings. She said I took it outside and let it fly free, and I realized Miss Rivers was right. I did start to feel better. Things would never be the same, but I would learn to cope. And the most important thing Beth told me was this. She said, I've carried that lesson through every struggle since. That one act of kindness and compassion continues to impact her life, and that was decades ago. We can't underestimate the impact of making our students feel safe and seen and stretched. Now, the frequency with which safe and seen and stretched showed up in this data was not a big surprise to me. It's probably not a shocking revelation to you. Really, it confirms decades of research on the power of student-teacher relationships. So if we know that we need to connect with students, that we need to create these strong relationships, if we know we need to make them feel safe and seen and stretched, why isn't it happening all the time? What gets in the way? I think we would all agree that teaching is full of distractions, yes. Some of them come from the outside, some of them are outside of our control. But if I'm being honest, the thing that distracts me most as a teacher is me. It's that noise in my own head, it's that constant chatter that I have to quiet down in order to focus on the people in front of me. And if I'm being real honest, my ego gets in the way because I like to be in control. Is that just me? Anybody else? So sometimes I plan this perfect lesson, such a great lesson, and then a student asks a question I didn't expect. Or a student has a need I didn't anticipate and messes up my perfect lesson. And I say to myself, man, I would be such a great teacher if it wasn't for these students. And then I realize it is not my job to teach a perfect lesson. It is my job to teach the imperfect people sitting in front of me. It is my job to help them learn and grow and stretch and become the best possible versions of themselves, because they wouldn't remember that perfect lesson anyway. Our students don't remember being taught. They remember being transformed. They remember those moments when we changed their hearts and minds and lives. They remember those moments when we connect with them and push them to grow. These are the things that have a lasting impact. These are the things that people remember for years, maybe even decades after they leave us. So I'm going to take us back to the beginning, to another big blue door. But this time it was 2012, and again I was feeling anxious and afraid to go in. I got a call from the superintendent and my assistant principal position where I was very happy, and she said, "We'd like you to apply for the principal job down the street. It's a struggling school. You'll be their third principal in 3 years, but I know you can do it." So when the superintendent calls, you say yes. And I went to the school to meet the faculty, and by the time I got the courage to push open that blue door and walk inside and look at the faces of the teachers I would lead, I was surprised when I recognized a familiar face. Now, she did not have long, straight brown hair anymore, and thankfully she was not wearing a white bell-bottom pantsuit. But Mrs. Russell had the same encouraging smile. And it happened so suddenly that we were surprised to see each other. And after that faculty meeting, she came up and she hugged me, and she stepped back and looked at me and she said, "I'm so glad I taught you how to read." And I said, "Me too." And I got to spend the next 3 years reconnecting with my first grade teacher and watching Nancy Russell do what she does best, making kids feel safe and seen and stretched, just as she had done for me. And here we are in 2012, my first grade teacher and her principal. And Mrs. Russell taught for 40 years. And she was just excited in year 40 as she was the year she taught me in first grade. And now I travel around the country talking to groups of educators. And whether I'm talking to professors on college or university campuses, or whether I'm talking to teachers and administrators in schools and districts, my message is always the same. And it's the same message I have for you today. You are someone's Mrs. Russell. You are the person that will change a student's life. And I challenge you, when you go back to your school on Monday, to just stop for a minute and look at the students you serve. And really think about how to make them feel safe and seen and stretched. And push aside for a minute the pressure to raise their achievement scores or the pressure to make sure they meet that standard. And just think about their stories and who they are and who they could become. Because you never know where your students might end up. And maybe one day, one of your students will end up standing on a stage talking to hundreds of educators about you. Thank you.